You've been signing your name your entire life, on school forms, on bank documents, on the back of checks, on birthday cards, on job applications that decided whether you'd eat well or barely. You've written it so many times it stopped meaning anything. Just letters, just a sound, just something you inherited and never questioned. But here's what nobody told you. That name, the one you scribble without thinking, may be the oldest military document your family ever produced. Not a metaphor, not a poetic stretch, an actual record. Carved into stone, stamped into bronze, written into the administrative archives of the most powerful military machine the ancient world ever assembled, the Roman legion. Music, stay with me, because in the next few minutes I'm going to show you 10 Italian surnames that don't just sound old. They are old. Old in a way that most people can't fully grasp. We're talking about names that were already ancient when Christopher Columbus was born. Names that were already fading from living memory when the Black Death swept across Europe. Names that trace back not to a village, not to a region, not to a trade, but to a rank, a battlefield, a legion marching through territory that is now Germany, Egypt, Syria, Britain. And here's the part that will stay with you long after this video ends. Most of the people who carry these names today have absolutely no idea. They think it's just a last name. They've never asked why. Music, we're covering 10 surnames today. 10 names that appear, not in legends, not in myths, but in actual Roman military records. Legionary inscriptions, discharge documents stamped in bronze, administrative rosters from garrison towns that no longer exist. I want to flag 2 numbers before we begin. Number 4 on this list carries a rank so senior that the man who held it answered to the Roman Senate directly. Not to a general, not to a governor, to the Senate. And families have been carrying that title as a surname for 2,000 years without knowing what authority it once represented. And number one is the rank that fewer than 1 in 100 Roman soldiers ever achieved. The absolute pinnacle of what a career soldier, not a senator's son, not a nobleman, but a man who started at the bottom and fought his way up, could reach inside the Roman military structure. If your surname connects to that rank, your ancestor didn't inherit status. He bled for it, campaign by campaign, decade by decade, until Rome itself had no choice but to recognize him. Stay until number 1. I promise it's worth it. Music, now before we go further, I know what some of you are thinking. My family came from a small town in Calabria. We were farmers. There's no way we have anything to do with Roman legions. Here's why that thought, while completely understandable, misses something important. Rome's legions were not staffed exclusively by aristocrats. Far from it. The legions drew from every class, every province, every corner of a territory that at its height stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the borders of modern Iraq. A Gaulish farmer could serve 25 years and retire as a Roman citizen. A Spanish shepherd's son could rise to command 80 men. A Syrian archer could end his career with a bronze diploma in his hand that legally elevated his children into a social class his own parents never imagined. These men didn't disappear when the empire fell. They had families. Those families had children. Those children passed down names. Sometimes the original Latin title, sometimes a shortened form, sometimes a word tied to a skill or a rank or a road or a weapon. And those names moved through the medieval period, survived the Norman invasions, survived the plague, survived centuries of regional dialect drift, and landed, some of them, in the hands of Italian families living today who have never once connected the sound of their own last name to a legionnaire standing in formation somewhere in Roman-era northern Italy, waiting for the order to march. Your name is older than you think. Let me show you what I mean. Music. We'll move through these 10 names in order, from number 10 to number 1. For each one, I'll give you the Latin root, the military function, and, most importantly, the human reality behind what that name meant to the man who first carried it. Not a textbook entry, a life. Because these weren't symbols, they were people. They woke up cold in fortified camps along the Rhine. They maintained equipment in garrison towns in Roman-era Judea. They drilled in formations on training grounds outside Carthage. They grew old in their postings, wrote letters home that mostly didn't survive, and passed their names, in one form or another, to descendants who eventually became Italian, in the way that everyone in the peninsula eventually became Italian. And some of those descendants are watching this video right now. Music. One more thing before number 10. I want to be precise about something, because precision matters when we're talking about history this old. These surnames don't function as genetic proof. Carrying one of these names doesn't mean you can draw a straight unbroken bloodline back to a specific Roman soldier in a specific legion. History doesn't work that cleanly. Names shift, records burn, families adopt surnames from landlords, from places, from occupations, from nicknames that stuck across generations. What these names do represent is a connection to a world, a military world, a Roman world in which specific skills, specific ranks, specific functions were considered important enough to become identity, to become the word that followed a man's personal name and told strangers what he was, what he did, what he represented. When that world collapsed, and it did collapse slowly over centuries in fire and plague and fragmentation, those words didn't disappear. They went underground. They survived in dialects. They survived in church records. They survived in the mouths of grandmothers in villages outside Naples and Genoa and Palermo who had no idea they were preserving the vocabulary of an empire. They survived as surnames, and now they survive as yours. Music number 10. Ferraro, from ferro, iron, the same Latin root that gives English the word ferrous. The same root embedded in the Spanish hierro, the French fer, the Portuguese ferro. A word so old, so fundamental to human civilization that it passed through the collapse of Rome, through the medieval period, through the Renaissance, and arrived in modern Italian almost unchanged. Iron. And in the Roman world, iron was not a material. It was a strategic resource. It was the difference between an army and a mob. Music. Think about what a single Roman legion required to function. 5,000 soldiers, each one carrying a gladius, the short stabbing sword that Roman infantry used in close combat. Each one carrying 2 pila, the heavy javelins designed to bend on impact so an enemy couldn't throw them back. Each one wearing segmented armor, the lorica segmentata, made of overlapping iron strips joined by hooks and buckles. Each one carrying a scutum, a shield reinforced with metal edging and a central iron boss. Multiply that by the thousands of metal fittings, hinges, nails, tools, cart components, and equipment brackets that kept a legion operational on campaign. Then multiply that across 30 legions deployed across an empire, stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia. The Roman military didn't just consume iron, it consumed iron at a scale the ancient world had never seen before and wouldn't see again for over 1,000 years. And somebody had to make it all. Music. The Fabbri, Rome's military craftsmen and engineers, held a specific and legally recognized position within the legion. They were exempt from regular combat rotation, not because they were considered weak or unfit, but because their skill was considered too valuable to risk in the front line. A trained faber, a man who understood the temperature gradations of a forge, who knew how to work iron without burning out its structural integrity, who could repair a cracked helmet under field conditions using whatever materials the campaign terrain provided. That man represented years of accumulated knowledge that couldn't be replaced by drafting a new recruit. Rome understood this, and so the blacksmiths marched with the legions. They set up forges in garrison towns. They operated out of military workshops in the great fortified cities along the Rhine and the Danube. They followed the army into Britain, into Judea, into the North African provinces, and everywhere they went, they left behind iron, in the form of weapons, tools, roads, buildings, and eventually, in some cases, descendants. Families connected to this trade carried the name Ferraro through the medieval period. It spread throughout the Italian peninsula precisely because Rome needed metalworkers everywhere it built roads, forts, and cities, which by the height of the empire meant nearly everywhere. If your name is Ferraro, your bloodline carries the trade that Rome could not wage war without. Music, but a blacksmith, essential as he was, operated in support of the men who actually held the line. And the men who held the line, who stood in formation while javelins came down and cavalry hit the flanks, needed someone to lead them, not from a safe distance, from the front, literally first into the collision. That man had a rank, and that rank became a surname. Number 9, Centurione, centurion. The word itself has become so embedded in popular culture, in films, in novels, in video games, that it's easy to forget it represents something real. A specific human being with a specific job description that was, in practical terms, one of the most demanding roles in any military force in recorded history. Music. A centurion commanded a centuria, originally 100 men, later standardized closer to 80, and represented the most consistent and experienced layer of leadership in the entire Roman military structure. Here is what made the centurionate different from almost every other leadership system in the ancient world. Centurions were not born into their rank. They did not inherit it. They did not purchase it. They did not receive it because their father knew someone on the Senate floor. They earned it through demonstrated battlefield competence, evaluated by men who had seen them perform under actual combat conditions. This was not normal in the ancient world. Most military hierarchies ran on birth and connection. Rome ran its mid-level command structure on something closer to merit. Imperfect, inconsistent, politically influenced at the edges, but fundamentally tied to performance in a way that most ancient military systems never attempted. And centurions paid for that rank personally. They led from the front, literally. Roman military doctrine placed the centurion at the right front of his unit's formation, the most exposed position in the line, because the expectation was that the centurion would be the first to engage and the last to retreat. The casualty rates among centurions in major engagements were significantly higher than among ordinary legionaries. They were easier to identify. They wore transverse crests on their helmets, oriented side to side rather than front to back, specifically so their men could locate them in the chaos of a close-quarters engagement. That visibility that helped their soldiers find them in battle also made them easier for the enemy to target. They accepted this, because the rank meant something. Music. The surname Centurioni survived directly into modern Italian, particularly concentrated in Liguria, where a noble family of this name later became prominent in the maritime Republic of Genoa, one of the most powerful commercial and military forces in medieval Mediterranean history. Think about that trajectory, a Roman military rank, carried as a name through the collapse of the Western Empire, through the chaos of the early medieval period, through the formation of the Italian city-states, until it lands in the merchant aristocracy of Genoa, a family whose ships crossed the Atlantic, whose traders operated from London to the Black Sea, whose name was still respected centuries after the legions themselves had become ancient history. If your name is Centurioni, your bloodline carries a Roman military rank so significant that families wore it as identity for 2,000 years after the legions disappeared. Music. Not every name on this list comes from a person. The next one comes from a road. Not metaphorically, an actual road. One of the most famous engineering achievements in human history. And the family name attached to it tells you something about who Rome trusted to build the infrastructure that held an empire together. Number 8. Appio, from the Via Appia, the Appian Way. Constructed beginning in 312 BC under the censor Appius Claudius Caecus, a man who, despite being blind by the time of the road's completion, oversaw an engineering project that would outlast him by more than 2,000 years. Sections of the original road surface are still visible today outside Rome. Music. The Via Appia stretched eventually from Rome to Brindisi on the Adriatic coast, a distance of nearly 600 kilometers, and it was not built for commerce. Not primarily, it was built to move legions. Roman roads were military infrastructure first and civilian infrastructure second. Every design decision reflected this priority. The roads ran straight because straight lines minimized travel time for troops moving on foot. They were elevated above the surrounding terrain because standing water slows an army and rots leather equipment. They were surfaced with fitted stone because a dirt track becomes impassable mud after 3 days of rain, and an army that can't move is an army that can't respond to an attack. The Via Appia allowed Rome to move a full legion from the capital to the heel of the Italian boot, in a time frame that would have been unthinkable for any other ancient military force. When a rebellion broke out in the south, and rebellions did break out, Rome's response arrived before the rebels had finished organizing. That speed was not accidental, it was engineered. Music. Families connected to road construction, surveying, military engineering, and the administrative management of road networks sometimes took locational names tied to the roads themselves. Appio survived as a surname, particularly in the regions the Via Appia passed through: Lazio, Campania, Puglia, the same territories the road was built to control. If your name is Appio, your bloodline may be connected to the literal infrastructure that made Roman military dominance possible. The roads that let legions arrive before anyone expected them. Don't move past this too quickly, let it settle. The road that Rome built to move its armies is still shaping family names in southern Italy today. That's not a figure of speech, that's 2,300 years of continuity hiding in plain sight. Music. The next name doesn't come from a trade or a road or a rank. It comes from a single piece of equipment. A piece of equipment so central to Roman infantry tactics that without it, the formation that terrified Rome's enemies for centuries would have been impossible. Number 7. Scudo, shield. From scutum, the large rectangular Roman shield, roughly 1 meter tall and half a meter wide, curved slightly to wrap around the body, constructed from laminated wood, covered in leather and canvas, with iron edging and a central iron boss called the umbo. The scutum was not a defensive tool in the passive sense, it was a weapon. Music Roman infantry tactics were built around the shield in a way that no other ancient military system replicated at the same scale. Legionaries were trained to use the scutum offensively, to punch with the umbo, to push into an enemy's chest, to destabilize his footing so the gladius could follow in the space created. But the scutum achieved its most devastating expression in the testudo formation. Tortoise. Entire units locked their shields together, sides touching, edges overlapping, creating an interlocking wall on the front, the sides, and above. A moving fortress, a formation that could advance under sustained missile fire, arrows, stones, javelins, and arrive at the base of a fortification wall with the soldiers inside largely intact. Ancient accounts of the testudo in action describe enemy forces firing everything they had at it and watching it keep walking forward. Music families associated with shield manufacturing, shield-bearing duties, or distinguished service in testudo-dependent operations carried scudo as an identifying name. The word later became the name of multiple Italian currencies, the shield shape appearing on the coins themselves. The military origin of the word quietly preserved in everyday commercial life for centuries. If your name is scudo, your bloodline carries the name of the single piece of equipment that made Roman infantry tactics possible. Music, but infantry, no matter how disciplined, has limits. It controls the ground it stands on and nothing else. To know what's happening beyond the next ridge, to pursue a retreating enemy before he can regroup, to arrive somewhere fast when speed determines survival, Rome needed something that moved faster than a man on foot. It needed horses. Number 6. Cavallo, horse. From caballus, the Latin term for a working or military horse, distinct from the more aristocratic equus. The distinction matters. Equus was the horse of the elite. Caballus was the horse that worked, the horse that pulled supply wagons, the horse that carried cavalry across broken terrain, the horse that was expendable in a way that a senator's prized mount was not. Music Roman cavalry, the equites, occupied a complex and evolving position in the military structure. In the early Republic, cavalry was an aristocratic function. Only families wealthy enough to maintain their own horses and equipment could serve as cavalry. This created a social dimension to the role that persisted, even as the military reality shifted. By the imperial period, Rome's professional cavalry came increasingly from the provinces. Numidian horsemen from North Africa, famous for riding without saddles or bridles and maneuvering at speeds Roman-trained cavalry couldn't match. Gallic cavalry from what is now France. Spanish horsemen who had been riding in similar terrain to Rome's western frontier provinces for generations. Syrian archers on horseback who could fire accurately at full gallop in a way that Roman-born cavalry simply couldn't replicate. Rome recognized this, and rather than trying to train Italian recruits to compete with men who had grown up on horseback, Rome recruited the specialists and integrated them as auxiliary cavalry units attached to the legions. Families connected to horse breeding, training, cavalry service, or the supply and maintenance of military horses carried the name cavallo forward through the medieval period. It spread throughout Italy as Rome's cavalry needs expanded across a territory that eventually required mounted forces from Britain to the edge of the Persian world. If your name is Cavallo, your bloodline may be connected to the mounted forces that gave Roman armies the speed and reach that infantry alone could never provide. Music and speed, the ability to move faster than the enemy expects, was not only about horses, it was also about walls, about what happens when an army stops moving and needs to survive the night in hostile territory, about the discipline that kept Rome's forces alive not just during battles, but during the long, cold, dangerous stretches between them. Number 5. Vallo. From vallum, the defensive rampart, the palisade wall, the fortified perimeter that Roman legions constructed around every single overnight camp, regardless of how briefly they planned to stay, regardless of how friendly the surrounding territory appeared, regardless of how exhausted the men were after a full day's march. Every night, without exception. Music. This is the detail that separates Roman military discipline from almost every other ancient army, and it's the detail that most people, when they first hear it, find almost impossible to believe. A Roman legion on campaign, marching through allied territory, moving between established garrison towns, covering ground they had controlled for decades, would halt at the end of each day's march, select a defensible position, and spend the next several hours constructing a fully fortified camp. Ditch dug, earth piled into a rampart, wooden stakes driven into the top of the rampart to form a palisade wall, 4 gates, guard towers, interior streets laid out in the same configuration every single time so that every soldier knew exactly where everything was, even in total darkness. Then they slept. Then they dismantled it, packed the stakes, filled the ditch, and marched again. Music. Why? Because the Roman military had a theory about surprise attacks that no amount of battlefield success ever convinced them to abandon. The theory was simple. An army that camps without fortification is an army that can be destroyed in its sleep. And an army destroyed in its sleep loses not just the battle, it loses everything. Weapons, supplies, officers, institutional knowledge, unit cohesion. It loses the campaign. It loses the province. It loses potentially years of strategic progress in a single night. The vallum was insurance against that scenario. Not cheap insurance. It cost hours of labor every single day. It cost muscle and blisters and time that exhausted soldiers would have preferred to spend sleeping. Rome paid that cost anyway, every night, for centuries. And because of that discipline, that obsessive, inflexible, almost irrational-seeming commitment to building walls around themselves before they closed their eyes, Roman armies were almost never caught by surprise in camp. In the entire documented history of the Roman legions, successful surprise attacks on fortified marching camps are vanishingly rare. The enemies of Rome knew the camps were coming. They could see the stakes being driven in from a distance, and they learned over generations that attacking a Roman marching camp was a way to lose men against a prepared defensive position in exchange for very little. The vallum worked. Musica, the word survived directly into English. Wall, the everyday English word for a vertical structure of brick or stone, comes from vallum. When you describe the wall of your house, you are using a word that Roman legionaries used to describe the defensive perimeter they built every night in hostile territory. Hadrian's Wall, the massive stone fortification stretching across northern Britain, built on the orders of Emperor Hadrian, beginning in 122 AD to mark and defend the empire's northern frontier, takes its structural name from this same Latin root. Families connected to fortification construction, military engineering, or the maintenance of permanent vallum systems along Rome's frontier zones carried this name into the medieval period. It concentrated particularly in regions that had been active frontier military zones during the imperial period, areas where the vallum wasn't a temporary marching camp feature, but a permanent landscape element, maintained by generations of soldiers who lived in its shadow. If your name is Vallo, your bloodline carries the name of the defensive discipline that let Roman armies operate for centuries in hostile territory without ever surrendering the initiative to an enemy attack in the night. Music. But a wall is only as strong as the command structure behind it. And the command structure of the Roman legion had layers, carefully designed, hierarchically precise layers that ensured information moved up efficiently and orders moved down without confusion. Number 4. Legato. Legate. From legatus, the senior officer appointed to command an entire legion. Stop and consider what that means for a moment. An entire legion, roughly 5,000 soldiers, not a company, not a battalion. 5,000 trained, equipped, battle-experienced men, plus the support staff, engineers, cavalry auxiliaries, and administrative personnel attached to that force. The economic output required to field, supply, and maintain that force for a single year in a distant province was enough to fund a small city, and one man was responsible for all of it. Music, a legatus legionis, was not simply a battlefield commander. That would have been demanding enough. He was simultaneously a military governor, a logistics manager, a financial administrator, a diplomatic representative of Roman central authority, and a judge whose decisions on matters of military law within his command were essentially final. He managed the legion's relationship with local populations in the territory it controlled, relationships that could mean the difference between a stable province that supplied Rome with taxes and grain and a rebellion that cost Rome 2 years and 3 additional legions to suppress. He managed finances. Legions were expensive. Equipment wore out, needed repair, needed replacement. Soldiers were paid. Officers were paid at higher rates with additional allowances. The administrative burden of tracking all of this across a force of 5,000 men, in a province potentially thousands of kilometers from Rome, was enormous. He managed discipline. Roman military law was specific, detailed, and harshly enforced. Soldiers who fell asleep on watch faced execution. Units that showed cowardice in battle could face decimation, the killing of every 10th man selected by lot, a punishment so severe it was reserved for catastrophic failures of collective courage. The legatus had the authority to order these punishments and the responsibility to judge when they were warranted. Music. I know what some of you are thinking right now. This sounds like a political position, not a military one. Were these men really soldiers, or were they just administrators with military titles? Fair question. Here's the answer. The most effective legati in Roman history were both. They understood battlefield tactics because they had risen through the military system before reaching this rank. They understood administration because Rome required it. The men who failed in the role, and some did fail catastrophically, were usually men who excelled at one and neglected the other. The legatus who was brilliant in the field but couldn't manage his logistics ran out of supplies at the wrong moment and lost campaigns he should have won. The legatus who was an excellent administrator but froze in battlefield decision-making cost Rome engagements that superior numbers should have secured. The role demanded everything. Music families descended from legates, or from the senior administrative staff who served directly under them, sometimes carried this title into surname form. It survived particularly in regions with strong historical connections to specific legionary garrisons, towns that had grown up around a legion's permanent base, where the legatus had been a visible and powerful presence for years or decades. If your name is legato, your bloodline carries the rank of men trusted to command the largest organized military units the ancient world ever produced. Men who answered to Rome itself, and almost no one beneath it. Music. We're approaching the top of this list, and as we do, the names shift from ranks and roles to something more specific, more technical, more lethal. Number 3. Balestra, from ballista. The large torsion-powered siege engine capable of launching heavy iron bolts or stone projectiles with enough force to penetrate fortification walls, collapse defensive towers, or devastate massed infantry formations from distances of several hundred meters. Several hundred meters. In a world where most combat happened at arm's length, where the decisive moment of most ancient battles was the collision of 2 lines of men moving toward each other, the ballista operated in a completely different register. It killed from a distance that felt, to the men on the receiving end, like an act of violence from an invisible source. Music. A ballista was not a simple weapon, it was a precision engineering instrument. The torsion mechanism, twisted bundles of sinew or hair that stored enormous mechanical energy and released it in a controlled explosion of force, required careful calibration. Too much tension and the mechanism failed catastrophically. Too little and the projectile fell short, wasting ammunition and giving away the weapon's position. Calibrating a ballista for accurate fire at a specific target, at a specific range, accounting for wind and elevation, required trained specialists. Men who understood the physics of torsion, even if they didn't have the mathematical vocabulary we use today to describe it. Men who had internalized through years of practice the feel of a properly tensioned mechanism, the sound of correct calibration, the adjustments needed when the temperature dropped and the sinew contracted. These men were among the most technically skilled soldiers in the Roman military, and Rome valued technical skill. Music Roman armies maintained dedicated artillery crews, ballistari, who were considered specialists rather than standard infantry. Their knowledge was complex enough that it was frequently passed down through training lineages and in some cases through family tradition. A ballistarius whose son showed mechanical aptitude might train that son in the trade, creating multi-generational families of artillery specialists whose identity became tied to the weapon they operated. The word survived into Italian as balestra, later applied to the medieval crossbow, a weapon that inherited both the name and the underlying engineering principle of stored mechanical energy from its Roman predecessor. If your name is balestra, your bloodline carries the legacy of the most technically advanced weapon system the ancient Mediterranean world ever fielded. A machine that killed at distances ordinary soldiers couldn't comprehend, operated by men whose knowledge was too specialized to be replaced. Music, one name remains before number one, and this name doesn't come from a weapon or a rank or a road. It comes from a document, a specific piece of documentation that represented something almost unimaginable in the ancient world. The legal transformation of a human being from one social category into another, granted not by birth, not by wealth, but by 25 years of military service to Rome. Number 2. Diploma, from the Latin diploma, a folded document. Specifically, in military context, the bronze military diploma issued to auxiliary soldiers upon honorable discharge after 25 years of service. These were not ordinary soldiers. Auxiliaries, the non-citizen troops recruited from across the empire's provinces, formed a critical component of Rome's military machine. They brought skills and regional specializations that Roman-born legionaries often couldn't replicate. Numidian cavalry, Syrian archers, Batavian infantry, recruited from the Rhine Delta region, who were considered among the finest heavy infantry in the empire. Cretan archers, whose skill with the bow was legendary across the Mediterranean world. These men were not Roman citizens when they enlisted. Music, they served for 25 years, not 5 years, not 10, 25 years. A career that consumed a man's entire young adulthood and most of his middle age. A career that took him from his home province, perhaps Gaul, perhaps Syria, perhaps the Iberian Peninsula, to postings across the empire that he could never have imagined when he first picked up a weapon. And at the end of those 25 years, if he had served honorably, if he hadn't deserted, hadn't been court-martialed, hadn't died in one of the campaigns that consumed auxiliary units at a frightening rate, Rome issued him a diploma, a folded bronze document stamped with his name, his unit, his years of service, and the imperial grant of full Roman citizenship, for him, and in many cases for his children. Music, understand what this meant. A Gaulish farmer's son who enlisted as an auxiliary cavalryman at age 18 could, at age 43, hold in his hands a legal document that transformed his social and legal status entirely. Rights his father never possessed, rights that his children would inherit. The ability to make contracts, to own property under Roman law, to have his marriage legally recognized, to give his children a legal standing in the most powerful political entity the world had ever seen. Thousands of these bronze diplomas have been recovered by archaeologists across the territories of the former empire, each one inscribed with a man's name, each one representing a life, a career, a transformation. Some families descended from veterans who received these diplomas carried the word itself into surname tradition, a permanent marker of the moment that military service had granted their ancestor something his birth never could. If your name is Diploma, your bloodline may descend from a man who was not born Roman, who came from somewhere else, who served for a quarter century in conditions that would break most people, and who earned 1 year at a time the identity that Rome reserved for its own. Music, and now, number 1. The rank that fewer than 1 in 100 Roman soldiers ever achieved. The single most senior centurion in an entire legion. A position that, if a man reached it, guaranteed his family an elevation in social status that would persist for generations, regardless of where he had started, regardless of what province he had come from, regardless of what name he had carried before Rome gave him a new one. Primipilo, Primus Pilus, First Spear. Music. The Primus Pilus was the senior centurion of the first cohort of a legion, the most experienced, most prestigious, most carefully selected centurion in the entire military structure. There was one Primus Pilus per legion. In an army of 5,000 soldiers with dozens of centurions, only one man held this rank. Reaching it required something that no amount of political connection or family wealth could substitute for. Time, campaigns, survival. A man who achieved Primus Pilus had typically served for decades. He had fought in multiple campaigns across different theaters. He had been evaluated by officers above him, year after year, and found not merely competent, but exceptional. He had demonstrated not just the physical courage required to lead from the front, that was baseline, expected of every centurion, but the sustained tactical judgment to make correct decisions under pressure across an entire career, spanning different enemies, different terrain, different command structures. Music, he had also survived. This sounds obvious. It isn't. The centurionate, as we discussed earlier, carried significantly higher casualty rates than ordinary service. A man who became Primus Pilus had made it through decades of frontline exposure, decades of the kind of combat that killed men around him, and arrived on the other side still functioning, still sharp, still capable of commanding the most prestigious unit in the legion's most prestigious cohort. The position carried rewards commensurate with its demands. Primipilares, men who had held this rank, were automatically elevated into the equestrian social order upon completion of their term. The equestrian order was Rome's second highest social class, below senators, above everyone else. A permanent, legally recognized rise in status that extended to a man's family and persisted regardless of whatever happened to him afterward. Some primipilares went on to even higher commands. Praefectus castrorum, camp prefect, the third highest position in an entire legion, responsible for training, equipment, and the day-to-day operational management of the force. A position that, in a legion deployed to a distant province, carried enormous practical authority. Music, think about the trajectory this represents. A man from a provincial family, no senatorial connections, no inherited wealth significant enough to purchase a commission. Nothing but whatever he was born with. Physical capability, intelligence, the particular combination of courage and judgment that makes a soldier effective over a long career rather than just in a single engagement. He enlists, he serves, he performs, he advances, year by year, evaluation by evaluation, campaign by campaign. He outlives men who started alongside him. He makes decisions that his commanders notice. He keeps making them, correctly, for decades. And eventually, not because of who his father was, not because of who he knew in Rome, not because of any factor outside his own performance, Rome looks at this man and says, "First spear, the best we have." His family carries that forward, for 2,000 years. Music, the surname Primipilo, surviving in various forms across central Italy, marks descent from a tradition of men who reached the absolute summit of what a career soldier could achieve within the Roman military structure. Not generals, not senators' sons, not men who were given authority, men who earned it. One campaign at a time, one correct decision at a time, 1 year of survival at a time, until Rome had no choice but to recognize what they were. If your name is Primipilo, your bloodline doesn't carry inherited privilege. It carries the record of a man who made Rome give him what birth never could. Music, 10 surnames, 10 corridors leading back through iron forges and military roads, through shield walls and cavalry charges, through siege engines and bronze diplomas, through the obsessive defensive discipline of men who built walls around themselves every night because they understood that survival is not accidental. Your name is not decoration, it is a military record, compressed into sound, carried across 2,000 years of births and deaths and migrations and plagues and wars and silences, until it arrived here, with you, in a world that has mostly forgotten what it once meant. Drop your surname in the comments below. Tell me if it's on this list. Tell me what you've always been told about where your name comes from. Tell me if it connects to something, a region, a trade, a word in a language you barely recognize. And I'll tell you what I know.
Here,
And if you know someone who
modern
traces
world
their family
blends
back to
seamlessly
Italy, a
with the
cousin,
echoes
a
of the
grandparent,
Roman
a
Empire.
friend who lights up every time the subject of ancestry comes up, send them this video. One share might hand them the first piece of a history they've been carrying their whole life without knowing it was there. Next week, we're going inside the naming conventions of the Roman Senate itself, the families whose surnames were so politically sensitive that they were deliberately erased from official records after certain emperors fell from power. And I have a document, an administrative archive fragment from 193 AD, the year of the 5 emperors, that shows exactly which family names were targeted and why some of them survived anyway, hidden in plain sight in the Italian peninsula for nearly 2 millennia. That one is coming next week. Don't miss it.